You're on the button with an unknown hand. You make an open and the big blind defends after small blind gets out of the way. The flop comes ace of hearts, 9 of clubs, 8 of diamonds. There are 4.5 big blinds in the pot, and when big blind checks you, you bet 1.8 big blinds. Big blind calls, and on the turn there are 8.1 big blinds in the pot. The turn's the 3 of hearts. You go for an overbet, you bet 11.96 big blinds, about a B150. Big blind calls again, and the river is the jack of diamonds. There are now 32.02 big blinds in the pot. Big blind checks to you. And there are two types of poker player in this situation. The first treats No Limit Holdem like it's Pot Limit Holdem, or worse still, Limit Holdem from 1978. And these players never really go all in this spot because they're afraid of stacking off. Winning or losing a stack can feel like game over in a computer game, and they don't want to feel that hollow experience of bluffing off 100 big blinds. The other type of player is the modern pro, or the solver, or prodigy, or Linus Love. These guys understand that when you're playing No Limit Holdem, the correct way to play the game, the way the game is asking you to play, is to put in the maximum amount of money in a spot where you have a lot of really nutty hands in your range. Your opponent's condensed isn't going to be doing much raising, and those nutty hands are extremely high equity and they want to play for all of it. You've got the bluff as well in these situations. In this river spot, you should really have two sizes. Your range kind of needs a smaller bet here, although maybe you could do without it, and then it definitely needs the all-in for the 2 point whatever X pot is remaining. In this video, I'm going to show you why it's important to have this in your game. I'm going to help you basically transform yourself from the 1979 7-card stud reg with a newspaper and some instant coffee into the modern pro who doesn't see 100 big blinds as a taboo thing to lose, but just sees stacks as dispensable resources that we can throw around as and when we please. Before we get into some solver work here, if you like this kind of content, let me know in the comments. I can make more of it. Also, we've revamped our Discord group. We've made a ton of really cool changes. We've introduced new roles like Carrot Squire and Carrot Knight, people who are actively and hungrily contributing to the community in a curious way where they want to help others. These people are getting promotions. There's going to be rewards and perks for people who have the golden carrot tag on Discord. For people who have done the full Carrot Poker School, there's going to be extra stuff going on, calls with Carrot Senseis, lots of hangouts and voice channels, coaching, stuff like that. How do you get into the Discord? Well, I'm afraid we've put the drawbridge back up. In order to get into our server, you now have to have a Carrot Poker School course or the Golden Carrot Pass. You can get all of those on Carrot Corner. And to celebrate these changes we've made, you can use code COMMUNITY for 20% off for 1 week only. Get in while it's a little bit cheaper. See you there. Now let's investigate why you've really got to start jamming this river. Alright, so before we look at this river strategy in detail, let's recap how we got here and what effect this action sequence has had on ranges. At the point where button bets small on the flop and big blind calls, a very important transaction has taken place between the two ranges. Big blind's range has capped and condensed. That means that they've shed the bottom. We talk about this at great length in grade 2 lecture 1 on polarizing and condensing. And button's range has basically gone, yeah, it's like polarized ever so slightly, depending on your strategy. If you range bet, it hasn't polarized at all. Some people will polarize a little bit more on the flop. If we have a quick look at the flop betting range for the button at this point, it's going to look a little something like this. You can see this is like a semi-polarized kind of thing, where it's not that no medium strength hands bet. You know, jacks is kind of medium to good. It's still betting. It's not hyper-polarized strategy. It's a small sizing. But there is a bit of polarization because we move away from betting things like king, queen, and kings, which are like the most stable of the higher and lower showdown value bracket hands, just for example. So at the point when this flop bet goes in, the range has become very asymmetric. Button becomes much more polarized relative to big blind. The big blind becomes more condensed and more capped relative to button, and it's really important later. There are a few types of turn card. There are firstly ones that are uncapping, and then there are ones that are capping. The uncapping turn cards here that would reset that nut advantage and kind of put button back to square one in terms of having that top of range edge would be cards like a 9 that pairs the second card on the board, an 8 that pairs the third card on the board. An ace to some extent is going to not neutralize fully at the very top, but it's going to give both players a plethora of ace-x that's going to like render the rest of range less relevant. Then you have cards like a 10 or a 7 or a 6 or a jack. These cards are going to be a bit less resetting to the nut advantage, but they are nevertheless going to give the big blind players some hands like straights and two pairs and things like that, and that is going to offset how much money button can put into the pot with their formerly unique hands like ace king that were doing really, really well on a brick turn, but not so much on like a jack turn or a 10 turn or a 9 turn. So the idea would be to size down on the turns like the 9 of spades or the 8 of clubs, and to size up on brick turns where your nut advantage is preserved. So on a turn card like the 3 of hearts that we're going to be looking at here, the main strategy would be to treat No Limit Holdem as No Limit Holdem, and it would be to use a big bet. Let's have a look at what that turn strategy would look like. We have the turn here, we have the big blind checking and button using a large overbet. You can actually leave the solver to its own devices here in AI mode in GTO Wizard and let it pick a sizing, and it will pick a bigger sizing than this. It'll actually go for like 2x pot. That doesn't mean that this is bad or like there's anything wrong with going a bit smaller. Generally, the rule in GTO is that if you can get lots of the money in one way or another, then it's okay. So like if villain is raising at the right frequency against a smaller bet, that could be okay. Or if you still have a street left where you could pile the rest in, or villain is raising throughout a combination of this street and the next street at high enough frequency, you can recoup, you know, what you don't get by increasing the bet size. But generally speaking, you want to go very big in spots like this on the brick turn that preserves all of your nut advantage. If you take a little look at this graph here, the range versus range graph, you can see that the button range is doing not very well towards the bottom percentage of both ranges because it just has far more air. Remember, button has not condensed. They've polarized a bit by betting the flop, but big blind has condensed. And what that means is that big blind is going to lack the hands at the very top of ranges here. So if you look at button's range, you're going to see a high-ish concentration of 9s and 8s and 9-8 and ace-9 and ace-8, and you'll see that those hands are betting at a very, very high frequency along with pocket 3s. They're basically pure bets, they're EV losses not to bet, and that's because it's just too urgent to get more money into the pot with these incredibly high equity, uncapped, nutted holdings, and they're the thing that's really driving this very, very big turn bet in GTO. So the first way to go from being a 1973 boomer reg to a 2025 Gen Z, Gen Alpha end boss is probably to like realize that the pot threshold is all in your head and you only think it's a thing because of like what someone said on Card Runners in 2008. And actually that's false what they said because no one knew what the hell they were talking about on Card Runners in 2008. No offense, Card Runners, that kind of goes for all of the training sites of that time. Yeah, this mental barrier, it really is one we want to start breaking down. We don't want to see overbet as some fancy, taboo, weird, like hyper-modern thing. It's just standard. It's been standard for a long time, and if you don't use overbets, it's time to start asking yourself why, because here's the deal in exploitative reality, kids. People actually don't raise you enough on the turn when you go for, like, pot. They're not meant to raise a lot on the turn, but they don't really bluff raise the river when you go pot, pot, for example. And therefore, if you have the uber nuts, you earn less money from your opponent in real life because they don't find that really skilled blocker jam sometimes. Like, when have you ever been shoved on as a bluff in the river when you've potted it? So, like, if people aren't bluffing enough against that, you probably just want to steer up your sizing and earn more when called. That would be the idea. Of course, when you go bigger, you get called at a lower frequency, but the EV of going bigger with a nutted hand is usually still much better if your opponent isn't playing a lot of raises against a small bet. And as I say, normally they're not. So we go for that sizing. Villain calls, and the river comes this jack. Now, you might look at that jack and think, oh, that's just like a kind of nothingish card. It's not that important. The jack is a hugely swingy, impactful river. It makes a very, very big difference to the range asymmetry here. It makes the ranges even more asymmetric than they were previously. What the jack does is it completes hands like gutters, right? A gutter is a hand on this board that on the turn constituted one of the lower EV parts of the in position betting range, but on this river, this is catapulted up to being a nutted holding, right? So if we take a look at those hands here, namely all of the combos of Queen 10, and we see what they were doing on the turn, we can see that they were betting at some frequency, not like a pure frequency. In reality, humans are probably betting Queen 10 and Jack 10 more than this. They're building more of an equity-driven, straight draw, heavy overbet range because that's natural to do. And they're missing things like 6-4 because, like, why on earth would I overbet the turn with 6 high? Well, that's exactly the kind of hand you should overbet on the turn with in a spot where your range is doing very well at the top, because you unblock the opponent's folding range. The thing is that, like, the combos with the 6 and the 4 in them kind of already folded on the flop, right? So they're not really part of the turn folding range as much. And therefore, when you have those cards, you're going to just unblock, like, the myriad, Broadway cards that called the flop to then have to fold the turn, and the 6s and 7s that called the flop and stuff like that. Like, the lower your cards are, basically, the more you're going to see these unblocker hands actually bluffing in these nodes, generally speaking. So when we get to the river here, which is the Jack of Diamonds, Queen 10 is going to get there. And that's going to cause Button to adopt a strategy like this. This is a very common thing in GTO. If you look at the Range Explorer now, you can see that Button's range is, like, massively polarized. It's, like, so split between, well, stuff that just hit the Jack. That's this lower bit here. So if you look at the part where it goes up and then levels off a bit between sort of 30 and 50% of range, that's Jack X that just hit, right? And it's kind of checking back, like, meh, I usually lose, but I win sometimes. Let's just see showdown. Below that, you have, like, the whole bluffing range that has usually no showdown value at all, but some of it has a little bit because villain had to call some hand. It's, like, a little bit worse. And then at the top, you have all of your strong top pair hands. They'll either be checking, when they're not quite good enough, like about here, or they'll be betting B75 about here, or whatever the smaller sizing your building is, and then you have your nutted region that's mainly going all in, but, for balance reasons and stuff, will use the smaller bet sometimes as well. That will rely in part on getting bluff raised by, like, ace-jack in this spot and stuff like that. So, like, with the GTO output, you're going to see them find bluffs that block your very best hands, that block your pocket aces, that block your straight. That's going to be something like ace-jack that's going to be jamming at highest frequency against your smaller bet, right? And that's probably why these nutted hands are mixing between the two sizes. But it's very standard and very important to understand that, like, when you have a hand like 10-7 and you've just made a straight here, that's the other hand that gets here on the river, you're going to want to go all in as a sort of default value play, and you're going to want to bluff all in this spot as well. Now, I would say it gets very, very tricky to work out the exact EV of different bet sizes here. Like, one trap I hear people fall into is that they want to know the exact highest EV line in every single spot against every player, and you can't really do that. I will say that against most people, the fold equity for going all in here in mass data exceeds what we need it to be. So when we look at big mass data reports, the pools, and we consider going all in for 84 here into the river pot of 32, that is closer to 3x pot than 2x pot, right? And you want to learn the fold equity milestones for that. If you risk 2x pot, your break-even point for bluffing is 66% fold equity. That's not actually that much when you think about how scary it is to face 2x pot for the average human in the games that most of you are playing, which is always 25 NL. God, I'm so sick of it. 25 NL. Anyway, and when you go 3x pot, you need 75% fold equity. Therefore, this being a bit closer to 3 than 2, like, we're probably needing like 72% fold equity or something for this to break even, this all in. And I think you're just going to get that against most people. So the first thing I want to say is that it's very possible that, like, lots of sizes are overfolded here against the human, but it's way more likely that the sizing that jolts them to fold with ace-x is going to be the most overfolded. So this is a spot where, like, MDA does support going all in as this bluff size, and it will be very, very good against the average reg at low stakes to go all in as a bluff here. It just will be. It'll be an underbluff spot and it'll be an overfolded spot. So they're right to overfold and you're right to bluff them, and you're the wolf in the sheep's clothing. That's kind of how it goes. Have a look at their defense strategy here. it gets extremely difficult for them. They're meant to mix call, like they're breaking even here by calling one of the ace-X that actually blocks straights, like ace-jack and ace-10. And that's the creme de la creme of the bluff catching range. Did I pronounce the French R correctly? Let me know in the comments. Otherwise, their ace-X just has like bad blockers, like negative blockers. Like, okay, they block a little bit of, like pocket aces or something, or maybe some like two pair with an ace, but they're also just not going to be blocking the straight, which is the most abundant part of your jamming range. So like with these low aces, they're meant to fold. But like the thing is that a human in general here isn't going to be mixing catchers. They're either going to be folding or they're going to be calling, and they're probably going to be folding, which means that if you run into like 100 regs in this spot, you might actually get very close to a range fold from something like, I don't know, okay, ace jack is two pair, I just realized that, but from something like, I don't know, 8 out of 10, like 80 out of 100 regs or something, might actually like just fold all one pair in this spot. And if you fold 100% of your one pair, like you're folding all of your ace 10 here, you can see how this could get overfolded. Okay, they're meant to fold like two pair combos as well, and that's where it's opponent dependent. And if the opponent's a fish, that's probably like not the right thing to do now, to take a line that involves them folding two pair. But I'd always check to see how much one pair they need to call with on a board like this. And the answer here is like not a tiny amount of it, basically, like a decent amount of it. And I think you'll find people that just always fold 9-8 and always fold ace-8 in those two pair hands in this spot as well. So this is an interesting line. Generally speaking, it's supported by MDA. It's something you should have in your toolkit. If not for value, then as a bluff, and if not as a bluff, then for value. There's three possibilities here, guys. Either one, you know your opponent's overfolding to this sizing, in which case you should be using it for bluffs. Two, you know your opponent's underfolding because they're like a sticky recreational player that's on tilt, and then you should just be using it for value. Or three, you don't know, in which case you should still be using it, but you should be doing it with more of like a default theoretical approach. There's not really an exploitative world where you can just say, I'm not going to use this sizing at all, I'm going to play poker like it's 2012 or something. There's not really that world. So I'd recommend learning to do this and knowing how to jam a spot like this for a few reasons. The first reason is that if you can play a lot of volume while normalizing just stacking off as a bluff in some random spot, and you can handle the swings that that brings, you will emerge out of that cocoon, out of that journey, a far stronger poker player. It's almost like doing like some really tough life challenge, like the guy that ran like through the entire continent of Africa or whatever. Like he probably emerged out of that like broken and, you know, like half dead, but also like mentally very tough, I would imagine. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So if you can go through 100,000 hands where you just familiarize yourself with jamming 3x pot on the river in the right spots, and you get called sometimes, and you go through streaks of being called 3 times in a row, then it works like 11 times in a row, and you just go through that whole grind mill, like you're just going to emerge out of a much better hardened battling poker player, rather than this like shell of a player that's afraid to stack off, that's always trying to preserve a stack, that wants to win a stack so they can celebrate, basically commiserates heavily every time they lose a stack, goes on tilt when they lose 2 stacks. You don't want to be that poker player. So the first reason to just add this to your game and start doing this is it will build resilience in the long term. It will make you a warrior, and that's what you want to be. Maybe that should be a Discord role, carrot warrior, someone who does this stuff. Let us know what you think in the comments. Another reason to do this is that it very much falls in line with our whole ethos these days at Carrot Corner. The next course I'm almost certainly going to be building is going to be about building unfamiliar, uncomfortable lines, but a repertoire, a toolkit, a game plan, an arsenal of those things. Basically, a carrot strategy. Who wants a carrot strategy? Hands up in the comments if you would like to be given a carrot strategy. Okay, you may have to pay for it, but that's another conversation. The whole point is to build lines that just constantly ruffle feathers, unsettle opponents, and you'll get a feel of how pool's reacting, right? When you start using these weird lines, you'll realize that people are much worse at facing them than they are the B33 on the flop or the line that they've studied. We call these sidelines in grade E of the Carrot Poker School. We're probably going to be making like a sideline course, and it's going to be like, hey, if you want to be a carrot disciple, if you want to like buy into this way of learning the game, here's basically a book a playbook, a strategy book for you that's made up of all this stuff. We're going to make that course. We are in the process of researching that course. Thank you for your feedback in the last video. But anyway, I digress. The point is that that's another great reason to have stuff like this in your game. The third reason for having this in your game is that it makes you a more theoretically correct poker player. It makes you someone who understands the theory of no limit hold'em as it's meant to be played and isn't playing it like they've just read Super System where pot is the maximum you can bet even though it's no limit. What a weird thing. What a coincidence if just somehow the right threshold for sizing your bets was pot. That's like so arbitrary, it's just unbelievable. Alright guys, if there's one thing I've learned in all of my years of coaching this game, it is that you cannot trust students to learn properly. Okay, you can over the long term with the right resources, but when you tell someone something once, you definitely cannot trust them to apply it properly. It's just not how we learn. I have seen students learn a concept and use it in the opposite spot from the one in which it was taught. Let's say that the flop was Queen Jack 6, and again, there's 4.5 big blinds in there, it's button against big blind, and you go for the 1/3 pot, the 1.47, big blind c-bet, big blind calls, turn is 7.44 big blinds, it's the 4 of spades, and big blind checks, and you go for 11.43, you go for the overbet, again, the 4 of spades being a very nut advantage preserving your top of ranges, phenomenal and invincible type of card. You go huge, big blind calls, the river's a jack of hearts, and big blind checks to you. Now, you are in a situation where all-in is prohibited. Why? Well, think about it. The human has taken all of their Jack X to that river, on average. That's what's probably happening here. Should they donk bet the river? Yes. They should. They should build donk bets on this river. Will they find that in the games that you're playing? Okay, if you're sat there like, actually, I play 1KNL and you shut up. Like, okay, yeah, it's not all about you. You need to try and understand it. This is a video made for a wider audience, most of which play 25NL, right? Or 50NL, or 100. And if you play those stakes, people aren't dong betting this river because they have 8 seconds to act. They don't find it. Some of them do, sure. Most of them don't. They check because they called the previous street. That means that this strategy here, I'm going to show you the big blinds donk bet strategy on this Jack of Hearts river. Very important for big blind to actually find that. Have a look. This is meant to contain all of the ace jack and king jack. That hand is a pure donk, look, basically. And a bunch of the boats and lower jack X and stuff as well is going to be playing that way. That's not going to happen in your games. So when your opponent lands on a street, either theoretically or exploitatively, with a very uncapped range, if you have a look at the graph there, you can see that that nut advantage that existed previously isn't really there. All-in is now not such a good idea. Now, I get it. There's still certain hands you want to go all-in with, like sixes, and you can still do that. But going all in as a bluff in this spot against a human who's got all of their Jack X is probably going to be a very bad idea and a very bad sizing. So I'd recommend using a smaller bet here if you are going to bet. Honestly, this is probably just an underfolded spot in general at low stakes because people aren't adjusting to the fact that their Queen X is going to become a fold a bunch of the time. Like top pair is just a catcher in this situation. It's not that good a hand. And so it's easy to see how that could get underfolded. But pay attention to spots where your opponent's range suddenly becomes uncapped, especially if they're meant to lead and don't. There are lots of spots like this in the game tree, and that's the number one time where I wouldn't just be like carelessly throwing in my whole stack as a bluff, especially against recreational players. This is just a really, really bad spot to bluff the river against a recreational player who's filtered turn by calling your overbet. You're going to have very low fold equity here compared to what you need. It's important to understand that there are some underfolded spots as well in poker. In summary, it will do your game a ton of good to build lines that are hard to face. It will do you a ton of good to start becoming more accepting of risk, of the risk that No Limit Holdem requires you to accept. I like the analogy of like poker asking you things, like poker being this sort of like boss that's telling you how you need to do your job. And poker asks you to be tolerant to a lot of variance, and we refuse. We say, no, I'm not going to be tolerant to that. I don't want to go down that path. I don't feel comfortable. I'm not okay with losing here. The only way to become okay with losing here is to really feel what happens after you lose and just go through it many, many times. Not, you know, ignore it and pretend you're okay, not to like lash out in anger, although maybe sometimes you'll do that, but to really just sit and like experience losing for what it is and like, is it really that bad to get called here? Like, what's really happened to you when you shove 100 big blinds here and get called? Like, how is that going to affect your dinner that evening? How's it going to affect like the next week? How's it going to affect the next year of your life? How will it affect your child's career prospects? It just won't, right? So let's not let our bodies treat going all in here and getting called as if it's some kind of shameful catastrophe. It's not. It will make you a battle hardened warrior. That's what we want you to become at Carrot Corner. You also want to do this so you can just understand the game better and see how it works and see how people are reacting. And you also want to do this so that you're not reading the newspaper in the card room. Because nobody likes the guy that reads the newspaper in the card room and it's like half peering over his glasses. We know that your limp raise is pocket aces. We know. And I'll leave you with that thought. Don't be that guy. See you next time.